Hi, everybody. I'd like to start this seminar with an acknowledgement of country, pay my respects to the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation and elders past and present. And I'd like to extend that respect to the elders past and present on the lands from which you're joining us today. I'd also like to extend that respect to any Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islander people that are joining us for this seminar. Okay. My name's Ben Spivak. I'm a senior lecturer here at the Centre for Forensic Behavioural Science, and I'd like to welcome you to our March edition of the seminar series that we run monthly. Now, the mission of the seminar series is to provide a forum for the latest developments in forensic behavioural science research and research in related fields like law and criminology and psychology. Today, we're lucky enough to have Associate Professor Jessie Cale from Griffith University, who will be presenting on pulling apart non-violent, violent and sexual offence trajectories amongst youth charged with sexual offences. Okay, but before we get to the presentation, I have a few things to cover off. The first is, this is a monthly seminar series. So every month we run a seminar with a different expert from a different field presenting kind of empirical research or the latest empirical research. It's a really worthwhile thing. In order to know about the kind of seminars that are happening and to get invited, we have a very exclusive email list. And you can join that exclusive email list by emailing the email you see before you. Now, if you do miss this email, or you join us a bit later, whatever it might be, I am going to be sending a feedback form following the survey for those of you that have attended. And there's the option there to add in your email, and we'll add you directly to the mailing list. Something you don't want to miss out on. All right. Now, just a small bit of promotion. Next month, the 5th Australian Youth Justice Conference is taking place in Melbourne, Victoria. On the 16th to the 18th of April, all things youth justice are going to be presented. The Centre for Forensic Behavioural Science is a partner assisting with organising this conference together with Victorian Department of Justice and Community Safety. So if you're interested in youth justice, and you must be if you're attending today's seminar, do yourself a favour, register and attend. A lot of very interesting presentations. Okay, so that's enough in terms of promoting different sorts of things. I'll get to today's presenter. Give me one moment. Oops. Okay. Wonderful. Okay. Today, our speaker is Associate Professor Jessie Cale, who is an Associate Professor in the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice at Griffith Criminology Institute at Griffith University. His main areas of research involve the causes and consequences of sexual violence, developmental criminology and criminal justice policy and evaluation. There's lots of accolades. He's been a chief investigator on several large-scale research grants in Australia funded by the Australian Research Council and different state governments and agencies examining the development of delinquency and criminal offending and the effectiveness of criminal justice policy responses. Just as an aside, when I was looking up Associate Professor Jessie Cale, you share a name with apparently a famous YouTuber and musician. So if you're here to see that Jessie Cale and you're confused about all the talk of sexual offending, please stick around. I'm sure the talk will be very informative for you. Now, before we finally get to the presentation, which I know you're all kind of dying to hear, a little bit of housekeeping. The session is currently being recorded and will be made available on YouTube in the next few weeks. Following Associate Professor Cale's presentation, we will be doing a bit of a Q&A if we have time. You can ask questions by typing into the chat box or by using the Q&A button, which you should find on the top menu here in Teams. you can enter your questions at any time during the presentation, but they'll be answered at the end of the presentation during that Q&A period. That's all. The other thing I'll say is typically the mics are already switched off, but if you can mute your last call to make sure that you've muted your mic, please make sure you do that. Thank you very much. And Jesse, can you share your screen, and I'll let you take over.
Is that working there?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Thanks, Ben. Thanks, everyone. Thanks very much for having me. Hi, everyone. I'm Jesse Cale. Yes, that YouTuber probably is not my biggest fan because he's a singer of some kind, I think, and so obviously you start getting Googled, and then all this stuff about sexual offending comes up. He probably isn't appreciating my work too much these days, but I haven't heard from him, so that's good. Anyways, thanks very much for having me. I also would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which we're meeting and pay my respects to elders past and present here on the Gold Coast, the Yugambeh and Kombumerri people. And I'd like to extend that respect to any Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people that might be with us today. Thanks for all coming. I wanted to present some research that actually started in 2010 when I moved to Australia. I'm originally from Canada. When I was in Canada, I finished my PhD in 2010, but during my graduate studies, I worked on several large-scale projects, one of which involved one of which where we interviewed, and in fact, the project is still running, and they still are interviewing kids who are incarcerated in the province of British Columbia. That also involved looking at their youth forensic psychiatric service case files. And so I was involved a lot in different capacities in this project during my time there. When I finished my PhD in 2010, there was an opportunity for a postdoctoral research fellowship with the Griffith Youth Forensic Service, which I was very interested in and successfully kind of moved to Australia to pursue. So for those of you who don't know, the Griffith Youth Forensic Service is a specialized treatment service for youth who commit sexual offenses. It's been running for a long time now. In fact, I believe Benoit Leclerc, our new director, is here, but it's we just received our 1,000th client, I believe. So from 2001, so that was quite a milestone. So it's been operating for quite a while under a field-based multi-systemic clinical practice model. Researchers have always been a part of the clinic, as I became in 2010 for a few years before I left to take up a lecturer position at the University of New South Wales in 2013. The objective of the clinic is obviously develop a comprehensive understanding of sexual violence and its prevention very generally. The research that I was interested in, and sort of talk a bit about what the basis for this particular line of research I'm going to talk to you about today and how it emerged, was that based on my early work with kids in British Columbia and Canada, and particularly incarcerated kids, so kids who were quite engaged in quite serious and violent behaviors and were incarcerated for them. In Canada, it's very similar to here. We typically, the kids who are in custody are there for quite serious and violent things. I'd sort of observed some of the, my PhD was on sexual offending, and I'd sort of paid attention to patterns that I was seeing with the kids incarcerated there, which is quite serious and violent. And so I remember one of the studies that always stuck out to me was a study that was done by, some of you may know who Michael Cito was. He's probably the top researcher in the field of sexual violence, and Stephen Butler in 2002, that kind of distinguished between kids who committed sexual offenses and kids who committed sexual offenses and other criminal offenses. And you have to look at the year that this was written and realize this was off the back of, in the United States, language around like super youth predators and juvenile sexual predators and super predators in the 1990s. And so what Michael's work and Stephen Butler's work kind of showed was that, you know, there's sexual offenses aren't all sort of the culmination of these really serious, violent, you know, patterns of behavior, and that essentially, you know, there's a lot of kids who commit sort of sexual offenses and don't necessarily have a history of violence, and the causes of those types of behavior are likely very different than the other kids who kind of engage in sexually harmful behaviors but have those backgrounds as well. But following from that again, and many may be familiar with the sort of developmental work and Terry Moffat's early work that kicked it all off in 1993 of life course persistent antisociality, adolescent limited antisociality, and essentially what kind of emerged was this idea that then among that group of kids, sort of that Michael Cito, I guess, distinguished between, Stephen Butler and Cito distinguished between, then that sexual offending was really kind of among kids who are involved in the criminal justice system, the outcome of sort of the culmination of life course persistent antisocial behavior, escalation of violence to sexual offending. There's all kinds of sort of research and literature around that. And to me, that didn't kind of go in line with the understanding, my observations of not just youth forensic psychiatric files, but sort of broader reading of literature too. So this early work and this kind of trajectory work it emerged in sort of the around 2005 from there. And so that's when this original study took place that I did. And that's what you're looking at is a graph from the original study that I published in 2016, that showed, you know, and you can kind of see that basically looking at patterns of the frequency of overall offending over the course of adolescence. And this is a sample from GIFs of 217 youth at that time who were referred between 2001 and 2009, 217 youth, and modeling their sort of offending patterns, just the frequency of overall offenses. And so you can see sort of a high rate chronic pattern, a low rate chronic pattern, a pattern of sort of a pattern of escalation. And then if you look at the rare offenders, essentially the group, half of the sample that in fact Michael Cito and Stephen Butler were talking about, that basically just had a sexual offense. And what the study showed as well too was that the nature of sexual offenses by kids who are characterized by different patterns tended to differ. So for example, kids who were who fell on this sort of pattern of high rate chronic offending and low rate chronic offending were more likely to have peer or adult age victims, whereas you saw child sexual abuse perpetrated by adolescents more in the sort of lower level sort of trajectories. So anyways, look, you know, this was innovative at that time. You know, understanding different longitudinal patterns of adolescence, what the correlates of those patterns were, and this was kind of the big rage for a while, and understanding correlates of patterns in the hopes of identifying risk factors associated with specific patterns, which I think has been done now quite a bit and has gotten us so far, and possibly even informed a bit of policy and practice along the way. But I wanted to delve into this a bit deeper. Now, I took a hiatus from GIFs because I was a lecturer at the University of New South Wales from 2013 until 2019 when I returned to Griffith. And so during that time, I didn't have a lot of opportunities to engage with GIFs, and I've been able to re-engage with GIFs since my time back at Griffith, but then there was COVID, and so there's been a lot of things that have happened, and I'm just starting to re-engage with this research from 14 years ago now. But I'm very happy to do so. And so what I wanted to do today was kind of pull this apart a bit and look and say, well, can we model sort of different patterns of offending? So remember, the prior modeling that we did was just looking at the overall frequency of offenses. And so what I wanted to do today was look and see whether you know, whether there's additional value to understanding nonviolent patterns of this particular sample of kids who've been charged with sexual offenses, whether there was heterogeneous violent, nonviolent, and sexual offense trajectories specifically, and if that actually adds any kind of knowledge to what what are some of our goals are. The second part of it too, and kind of based on some of the things that I uncovered in the first part, I'm going to present some of the work that was also my co-author's honors thesis, my former honors student, looking at a collective case study of sexual offending among people characterized by a persistent, chronic trajectory, essentially the one you see here peaking at the top, and sort of hopefully tie it all together, I hope, into kind of a few key points as to what I want the takeaway for this to be. So what do qualitatively unique trajectories tell us in terms of, let's start with nonviolence. So the first thing you should notice here is that probably looks very similar to the overall modeling of the original study, as it should, because the bulk of offenses that this modeling is typically based on are the offenses that kids are being charged with are actually nonviolent offenses, property offenses, and so on and so forth. And what you can see here is there's actually a line, a blue line across the very bottom on the x-axis, and that's almost 2/3 of the sample who, and again, remembering that these are all kids who've committed a sexual offense and have been referred for treatment, and sort of that are characterized by this rare offense trajectory. So these are kids who, if you look at the blue, that corresponds to the trajectory line, is that had only sex offenses, they're actually enrolled in school, they're older at their age for sexual charges, they had a higher proportion of sex offenses relative to non-sex offenses. So in this case, on average, 83% of these kids' criminal histories involve sex offenses. Now, a caveat to that, and it's important, is that you have to remember that doesn't signify specialization in sexual offending, or that sort of, but keep in mind that proportion could reflect one youth, for example, who has one sexual offense and one non-sexual offense, and then that proportion is 50%. So this is actually a function of the lack of sort of other offending that they've engaged in. In terms of their referral sex offense characteristics, so the characteristic, for what they were referred to gifts for, they typically only had charges for a sex offense at referral. So in contrast to other cases, some of the offenses for which kids referred, for example, would have violent charges associated with them, maybe even non-violent burglary, for example, things like that. But in this particular, for these particular youth, they were more likely to have family victims, child victims, as well as male victims. When you get into the other sort of patterns, and this is essentially actually the findings from the original study, you see that the sort of higher rate chronic and low rate chronic groups typically have sort of the background of that you would expect among sort of those groups, sort of child protection history, for example, substance use, sexual offending prior to gifts in sort of some of the kids, having served time in custody, much more likely to be remote, and sort of a different profile in terms of the victims associated with their offenses, often typically being older and also having violence and nonviolent referral charges in addition to their sexual offense charge. So this is essentially the findings from the original research. This is just looking at nonviolence though, and so we wanted to look at modeling just patterns of violence. And so to do that, we just looked at whether or not modeling violent offenses over time tells us anything in the sample. And as you can see, again, there's a sort of a trajectory along the bottom there that 2/3 of the youth never even charged with a violent offense over the course of adolescence. That's very similar to the last sort of patterns that we saw. About 2/3 only had sexual offenses. They're older. They had a higher proportion of sex offenses relative to non-same sort of types of victims in their offenses. And when you actually look, and remembering that this sort of method is of analysis that I won't get into today, group-based modeling is kind of designed to pull apart these patterns. The question is whether they're in fact meaningful. And when you look at actually the patterns that emerge here, there's really not much differentiating patterns of violence among the sample, whether it was their they both had child protection histories, time in custody. There was sexual offenses prior to gifts among sort of this green sort of escalating trajectory. But it's also important to note that there's a relatively low base rate of cases here, especially in sort of the more serious violent trajectory. So that could be an artifact of the analysis, or it could be a kind of simply saying that, you know, when we're considering different patterns of violence and correlates of them, in this context, it might not be as important, but that's something that hopefully we're going to look at down the road, in fact. But as for now, we can kind of leave it there, and there's some question as to whether this is sort of useful. Now, finally, I looked at sort of modeling the sexual offense trajectories, and I think some interesting things emerged here. So again, there's a very low base rate of repeat sexual offense, but I think the first thing that should stick out is that 90% of these kids had one sexual offense over adolescence, essentially. So I guess, you know, when there's a lot of concern about sort of kids and repeat sexual offending. Why is this possibly the case that there was treatment effect, which you didn't measure? Well, we'd probably like to think so, or is it sort of also part of the reality of this the nature of this kind of offending, that it's actually quite infrequent? So 90% had a single sexual offense, but among, and again, a relatively low base rate, but among a small proportion of the kids who characterized what we kind of called the repeat sexual offense trajectory, they had actually the highest proportion of sex offenses relative to non-sexual offenses in their history. So this is actually indicative of quite a high level of specialization in sexual offending, given that they've committed multiple sexual offenses and other offenses too. But in terms of background characteristics, actually no difference between the groups in terms of backgrounds of violence. According to these patterns, there wasn't really any difference in violence charges between the two groups, about a third each. There is a high proportion of nonviolent charges relative to overall in the single sort of sex offense trajectory group. And in terms of the referral sex offense characteristics, the repeat group sort of was more likely to have familial victims as well as offenses with multiple victims. And I'll talk a bit about those contexts a little bit later. So when it comes to persistence in offending, which was sort of one of the things I want to look at here, is, you know, we know the research is fairly consistent on the fact that there's quite a robust relationship between things like persistence, versatility, so engaging in many different types of crimes, as well as seriousness. The more sort of offending, the more likely there is to be sort of serious offenses as well among kids. There's no exception here. When I did some analysis looking at sort of basically just what I guess would be joint frequency distributions of persistent kids who had a persistent violence pattern or not, persistent non-violence pattern or not, and a persistent sexual offense pattern and not. Persistent violence was obviously associated with persistent non-violence, but actually not sexual offending. So the persistent sexual offending trajectory is in fact not associated with the persistent violence trajectory. So that's actually, I think, quite important and sort of, I think, let's see if that goes towards one of the points that I want to make through the rest of the presentation. Well, actually, there they are, which would be two hypotheses that I'd propose. And one is that is understanding sort of sexual offending as part of a pattern of early onset, persistent, versatile offending, where sexual offenses kind of are a manifestation or extension of basically antisocial behavior opportunity, versus sort of a pattern of early onset, persistent sexual behavior problems characterized by what we can call heterotypic continuity in the sexual behavior domain specifically, meaning sexual behavior problems that start early, that might sort of be reflective of boundary problems and things like that. I'll get into some examples in a bit, but actually kind of persist through time, but look different over time. And if that's the case, then, you know, it's really important to understand sort of these different, I guess, pathways that can sort of manifest in terms of sexual offenses, but they're in fact very different. And so maybe going into a collective case study of persistence can maybe shed a bit of light on that. So what I wanted to do from the original study, and this was part of Taylor's thesis, was really look at this group of what were labeled as high rate chronic offense pattern in the original study, and looked at the 12 clinical case files of these kids that was who were convicted of sexual offense between 2001 2009, subsequently referred to gifts. Again, this is based on the overall frequency of charges, like I mentioned, not the last few models I was showing you. And one of the things we wanted to do is some of the work that I did with Stephen Smallbone, who is some of you may know who's the founder of GIFTS, back in 2015, and we did some theoretical work looking at sort of developing an integrated life course developmental theory of sexual offending that is essentially a multi-factor theory that considers sort of broader ecological systems, including sort of from neighborhood and those contexts to families, and sort of incorporating processes like social control versus social bonding or development of self-control, the role of individual vulnerabilities, and kind of just tying all these together and understanding how sexual offenses occur in a specific time and place and are an interaction of situational characteristics and individual characteristics of the kids sort of commit them and what they bring to those sort of situations. And so that's in a nutshell. If anyone's interested, I'm more than happy to kind of forward you that. But what the aim of the thesis was to look at the domains, using this as sort of a theoretical framework, look across these multiple developmental domains and see kind of where there was concordance and discordance, because to some extent you'd expect there would be probably relative concordance across a group of kids who are characterized by quite a similar high level pattern of involvement with the criminal justice system, if you want to put it that way. But the basis of the analysis, which is a collective case study analysis, is looking at sort of concordance and discordance. So again, it's a relatively small group of kids, but these are a relatively small group of kids who are engaging in this sort of level of behavior as well. And of course, it's a sample, but the sample is, in this context, just really briefly to give you an idea, half of the kids were Indigenous, and half were located in sort of remote versus urban settings. So it was kind of selected like that to try and compare. And then the reason there's 12, because in reality, I think in total there should be about 19, was because when in the earlier days of gifts, a lot of referrals could have been made, but for various reasons, they might not have been taken for treatment. Again, various different reasons why that might occur, from resourcing to all kinds of different issues. And so, in fact, for some of the cases, we needed the detailed clinical files, obviously, to be able to look at this. And in some of those cases, the files weren't theirs because the kids were referred, and we had all of their offense data from youth justice or from Attorney General, I can't remember, the administrative data associated with their charges, but obviously not clinical data. So what were some areas of concordance among the domains and across the cases? So in terms of concordance, family dysfunction across urban, remote, Indigenous, non-Indigenous was a virtual constant. And this probably isn't surprising to anyone in the room. The presence of intimate partner violence in the family, again, was essentially, I think, consistent across all the cases. And kids, often the youth themselves, were typically either the direct or indirect targets of victimization. There was parental separation, rejection, and abandonment that was, again, consistent across all the cases, sometimes as a result of intimate partner violence, for example, possibly the kids being removed from intimate partner violence situations, for example. In a few cases, in fact, the death of a parent or family members, and specifically fathers. So look, I mean, I think I don't know how else to put this, and I want to sort of belabor it. So I kind of just say general and quite severe neglect. And look, between my research with gifts and the research I've done in Canada, looking at having read through literally hundreds, if not thousands, youth forensic psychiatric service types of files. And again, many people in the room probably realize you go through these files and it's never kind of a mystery as to how these kids ended up where they were, or how they've done what they've done. They're literally, I always describe them when I teach as just roadmaps of adversity to really horrible outcomes. And this is sort of what kind of the best way I wanted to sort of explain it. And it's just absolute tragic. And that's sort of a consistent aspect of these cases, sadly. You had, so while again adverse child experiences, including abuse, were consistent across sort of all the cases, there were sort of some different ones. And again, going into, I'm not going to get into that sort of argument here, and I feel like I've got a lot to say about it based on research, but the sort of link between sexual abuse and abuse, and again, not less than half of these small number of young people had sexual abuse experiences. So I know a lot of the work that Ben and the group do have looked at this as well, and this idea that sexual abuse is a causal risk factor for sexual violence is actually really problematic. And in fact, even surrounding the advocacy, all of the advocacy that's happening around it right now, it's actually problematic in a lot of ways for survivors, because the implication of causality implies that they would become offenders too. And I don't know if people realize that or not, but I mean, none of the evidence points to sort of being causal. And then again, here, less than half of these kids had it, but some of them did, and undoubtedly has obviously an impact on outcomes. But in terms of just general sort of adverse child experiences, one of the other themes that emerges is extremely tenuous social bonding. So low academic achievement, which results in bullying, in being bullied, in fact, being victimized, which then we observe the sort of that cycle that's been described in a lot of research of where then kids are engaging in verbal, physically aggressive behavior towards their peers and teachers as well. And again, these are observations we're making across these cases I'm telling you about. And then disciplinary interventions as a result, and disengagement from sort of education in general in that particular context. General social rejection. And then now I just feel like I'm reading out of the textbook. So, attachment to antisocial peers, chronic substance abuse, and so harmful cognitive, and sorry, the last one is quite important. In fact, the very, very consistent theme of sort of harmful cognitive distortions around intimacy and sexuality. So these are essentially the risk factors that we understand to be associated with quite serious involvement in the justice system. So there's not, I don't think, anything really profound, I guess, about this. But looking at the discordance among domains across the cases, I think produces something worth thinking about, a few things worth thinking about. So the first one is around family structures and context. And so again, it's not necessarily a surprise that there's substantial difference in the traditional family structures between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. And on the one hand, in Indigenous families, this sort of means that there's more caregivers around, or potential caregivers around, to be involved in the upbringing of these young people. But obviously, in sort of the context of difficult socioeconomic circumstances and lack of basic infrastructure, and I mean in certain contexts, remote communities that don't even have running water, so extremely impoverished conditions and residential overcrowding, resulting in violence among the family, a lack of familial stability, sometimes due to just transience of family members in and out due to employment opportunities and many other reasons. There's sort of an absence of supervision, absence of positive role models. That I want to tie back to one point on a previous slide as well. Because in Indigenous cultures, it's typically, it's the role of males, of fathers and uncles, to educate young men, typically about relationships, intimacy, and sort of and navigating those. Well, in some of these contexts, these people have died, and these fathers or uncles have died, and sometimes as a result of suicide. Accidents were common as well, and so you've essentially removed in some cases the source of information about healthy relationships and sexual, not removed, but the source of healthy relationships and intimacy, the source of information that's supposed to come from simply isn't there. And as a result, and as a result of the adversity experienced among these kids in their homes, they'll tend to avoid being in their homes. And growing up in a working class sort of background in Canada, and I had a lot of friends as well growing up in this context, and I remember it quite vividly. So having friends who were, whose parents were quite abusive and drank a lot and these sort of things, and so they just wouldn't go home or stay home as you wouldn't. So it was actually smart. And so this kind of tends to have the effect of kids sort of spending more time out of the home, obviously, and in the community, and connecting, for example, even through sort of semi-employment opportunities, through connecting with older peers or even young adults or middle-aged adults in terms of their peer networks, and then sort of learning about sexuality in these contexts. But in the context that I'm talking about right now, sexual offenses were typically taking place in the community when they did among these youth. And among non-Indigenous youth, a key difference was the sexual offenses among the group that I'm talking about were actually typically took place in the home against younger family members, where there was minimal supervision taking place. And I'll talk a bit more about that on an upcoming slide. So where else was there? Discordance among the domains. So I kind of touched on it a bit, but differences in sort of what I would call the social learning mechanisms around sexuality and sexual development. So understanding of sexuality and sexual behavior across all of these youth was accompanied by various harmful cognitive distortions around sex and intimate relationships. But the modeling of these behaviors, what kind of became very clear was it was coming from different sources. And among non-Indigenous kids, there was a really strong theme of pornography use from a very young age, and a lot of it in terms of how they were kind of formulating their ideas around intimacy and sexual behaviors and what's appropriate and what's not. In sort of in non-Indigenous kids was the theme. And as I mentioned, it was a very different context when it came to sort of sexual behavior among Indigenous youth, or understanding sexual behavior among Indigenous youth, where the sort of the themes that emerged were sort of this early onset normalization of sexual behaviors and sharing of these experiences across peer groups. And oftentimes in these contexts, what we saw were, in terms of the offending, were group offenses, peer pressure to offend, witnessing peers or watching their peers have sex. There was also offending against adults, a stranger of adults. It's sort of this copying of certain behaviors among the peers. So if sort of to the extent to which there's a social learning process at work in these types of offenses, they were very different for non-Indigenous kids. And I mean, in some of these remote communities, I mean, I wonder as well too about things like internet access and the extent to which that limits the ability for sort of pornography to be able to be consumed or not. I don't know, but I don't know if that's a possible explanation as well. But this is a very stark contrast, and that kind of emerged. In terms of the offense characteristics, so there was a very, across all of the actual offense characteristics of these cases, a wide range of circumstances, a wide variety of victims, offense characteristics, level of harm caused. In terms of offense characteristics of intrafamilial sexual offenses, there were sort of what I would consider to be sort of opportunistic but very unique motivations among non-Indigenous young people. So sexual offenses in the family context, and keeping in mind I'm talking about a very small group of individuals that we looked at who were characterized by a broader offending pattern. The familial offenses were actually only evident among non-Indigenous youth. Now, don't take that to say that that doesn't happen among Indigenous kids, but in terms of this group of relatively seriously justice-involved youth, and this relatively small group, in this case, it happened to be only non-Indigenous youth. And in some of these cases, were cases of repeated victimization of younger siblings over the years. And so what was kind of emerged from these was that, and once you kind of got into the files a little bit, was these are scenarios where older kids who probably lacked the capacity to be in caregiver positions were given these roles, sometimes possibly out of necessity because both parents were working, sometimes it might have been out of indifference, and sometimes it may be for other reasons. But nonetheless, older siblings typically put in charge, and keeping in mind, but please keep in mind that the population, if you will, that we're talking about, and charging them with the care of younger siblings. And so what you kind of saw routinely in these cases where this was the pattern of interfamilial offending was this just lack of sort of capable guardianship in the home. And in terms of the motivations for the offending, it was again very different in the sense that this abuse was, and this kind of emerged from the clinical work, obviously, this abuse was being used to fulfill sort of unmet emotional needs, but at the same time using coercion and manipulation. And so in a way, I would explain it in the sense of a lot of the work that Benoit and I actually have done with adult offenders, Benoit specifically, in terms of motivations for child sexual abuse and the sort of how we understand grooming, and the idea that a lot of these men who abuse children actually have the idea that they're teaching kids about sex and actually do have intimate feelings for these kids. And it was a similar sort of pattern that we kind of saw, but they're using coercion and force to achieve that. And it's based on really cognitive distortions about relationships. And in a couple of the other cases, we saw the sort of link with pornography to a pattern of exclusive sort of, and I'll say sexual offending behavior, but I just have to be careful not to go into obviously too much detail. So cases where essentially the use offense profile over adolescence was exclusively sexual offending, not necessarily even sort of violence or sexual assault, but essentially offenses that facilitated sexual fantasies. So breaking into someone's home to steal sort of underwear or something like that. And so a whole sort of, so it's a very different pattern of behavior than anything like, than sort of a pattern of a history of violence where a young person might find themselves in a context of a sort of an intimate encounter where consent becomes an issue and they decide that it's not an issue and then use violence or coercion to sort of have engage in sort of sexual relations or whatever behaviors, versus here sort of a pattern of behavior that's facilitating fantasy. And if that makes sense, I might leave it at that. So what are some interpretations and future directions? So I wonder if this sort of gives us something to consider around so drawing it back, and we hear these kind of trajectories this trajectory talk, which I've noticed is starting after all these years to filter into policy talk and speak, and which I find, I used to work in policy in like 2006 as well. So, and so I find that interesting, but at the same time, and not necessarily a bad thing, but at the same time, you know, are we boiling down certain things? And I guess in the context of my presentation on you know, harmful sexual behaviors among youth, are we boiling things down too far when I've just explained to you that there's a consistent set of risk factors among these kids with a pattern? But I think I presented a lot of very unique context to understand the unfolding of these behaviors. And so I wonder, to what extent do we start, if all the risk factors are the same and the outcomes, and we know what they are, we've known for a long time, I don't suspect we're going to find any, you know, atoms being split in risk factor research in the next while. It's done. We understand I think there's interesting work going on. I think there's interesting work going on in terms of you know, mediation moderation effects, and particularly the work in birth cohorts and population representative studies. And I think a lot of that work is shedding a lot of good light. But if, you know, we know that these are the risk factors, and yet there's these various outcomes in dramatically different contexts in terms of the unfolding of sexual violence, that's only going to get us so far. And so what I would argue, I guess, is looking at sort of shifting our understanding of sexual offenses as more than just sort of an offense or an act of violence, but understanding it, number one, is either sort of an extension of a wider pattern of antisocial behaviors like overt, covert authority conflict and reckless behaviors, versus understanding a far smaller proportion of these cases as a wider pattern of sort of pathological or problematic sexual behaviors. I think through sort of, particularly through the case study analysis, we can identify a lot of primary prevention targets. Basic infrastructure and health is probably a good start. But going from there, the other one is looking at really considering the role of intimate partner violence. I published a study with a colleague in 2017, and it was based on a longitudinal birth cohort of a small sample of kids in Vancouver, in Canada. There's about 350 mothers who were followed from birth and followed up every year or two. I think they're up into the teens now. I'm not sure if the study's in fact still going, but what in short, what we showed was that in families characterized by intimate partner violence, and specifically intimate partner sexual violence, kids were more likely to start displaying behavioral problems, sexual behavioral problems, between 3 and 5 years old in the context of intimate partner sexual violence. And so why is it that they're seeing it? Probably not. But does it have something to do more around the nature of relationships characterized by that kind of behavior, boundaries, issues around boundaries, and these sort of things? So if what I'm saying is that you can start observing patterns of sexual behavior problems among kids who are coming out of who are 3 to 5 years old in the context of families that are characterized by intimate partner sexual violence. And here we have a context where virtually, in at least the cases I described to you, virtually all of them are characterized by intimate partner violence. I'm not sure about intimate partner sexual violence or not, but nonetheless, I think there's more and more research kind of emerging on the impact of intimate partner sexual violence and intimate partner violence in general on sort of these types of behaviors as well among children and adolescents growing up. And if you take it from an attachment perspective, it obviously makes sense. If this is how you're learning to negotiate, if this is your model of negotiating relationships from an early age, it's then doesn't really become surprising why you see sort of different disruptive attachment patterns or harmful kind of cognitive distortions around intimacy and relationships if you're growing up in these kind of contexts. I think looking at sort of understanding sex offenses more than act of violence and versus pathological versus opportunistic types of offenses also gives us a lot of implications on what to intervene about or what to intervene on. So interpretations, future directions. So having just re-engaged sort of with GIFs in the last few months, we're currently in the process of updating the data to address the low base rate issue and reanalyze the data. I'll probably do a complete reanalysis with the entire cohort, and it probably won't include up to 1,000, but up to probably about 2020. So we have more of a contemporary sample. And the other thing is, I should have mentioned that earlier. So there's also been a change. So GIFs has over the years has shifted towards prioritizing higher risk clients for treatment. And so that changes sort of a lot of the prevalence of things I was showing you today in terms of the modeling quite dramatically, in fact. And that's where I wanted to kind of note that this research is, and I wanted to put a caveat along with this research, but all research on it. And that's when you're looking at the kids who commit sexual offenses or kids who are, who engage in harmful sexual behaviors are going to filter into different places for different reasons in the justice system or not in the justice system, in schools, for example. So when you're reading studies on this, it's really crucial to pay attention. So for example, a study we published a few years ago looking at psychopathy among incarcerated youth, and this was with the Canadian data, showed that actually kids who had committed sex offenses scored quite higher on the PCLYV than the other kids. Well, that's a very different sample than what, for example, I'm describing to you here. These are incarcerated youth in youth forensic psychiatric services in Canada. And so reading this research kind of across and can be sort of challenging like that. And the current samples sort of there's no exception to that. In the current sample, there was quite a mix, in fact, of kids who would have been considered higher risk and lower risk. Updating the data, we know that over the years, and particularly in recent years, GIFs is actually has been engaging with quite serious kids with quite serious profiles. And so that was just a point I wanted to raise as well. But hopefully more research to come in the near future. Thank you very much for your time. And if there's time, I'm happy to chat or have any questions.
Thank you very, very much, Jesse. That was such a rich presentation. We do have time for a few questions. If you haven't entered a question yet, there's still time to enter it into the Q&A section or the chat box if you can't see that. So the first question comes from Shuna Howard, I believe. Has your research looked at young people's sexual violence as part of broader intimate partner violence? Anecdotally, with young people I work with in a custodial setting, they've been charged with physical assault and stalking, etc., but not necessarily sexual violence, even though this is a strong component of behavior within their relationship.
So let me just read. The short answer is no, but I just wanted to hang on. I just want to read that really quick. So I was actually speaking with the clinicians not too long ago, and it kind of struck me something in the question. And one of the things that they sort of mentioned was one of the observation that that in recent years, some of the they had at least the perception as a clinician as clinicians who have seen a lot of clients now, that there has been a change, and they don't know why, a change in sort of, now could it be referrals maybe, but a change in sort of the types of offenses that they're seeing, and also the levels of violence and sort of that. And the other thing I might tie into that, and because it was a question that I had for them when I first kind of came back, and was sort of where and when did we start seeing the tech stuff kind of filtering in, because the data is there. It's from 2000. So that was before Facebook. And so what I'm really interested in is kind of seeing, and I think that could probably tie into the stalking, especially now, into the stalking kind of comment and charges, as to kind of how, yeah, that's influencing it. So sorry, the short answer was no, but it kind of sparked a couple of things in my mind when I saw the question. So I hope that was at least somewhat interesting.
Yep. I actually had a question. I was kind of interested in the pornography link. Obviously, we've seen kind of a rise in access to pornography. Has there been any research looking at whether that rise is also associated with the rise in kind of child sex offending?
Yeah, to be honest, again, I don't know. The pornography research is really tricky because people have been trying to use that to pin on sexual offending as a for year back into the 80s, and usually, Christian groups and stuff. But and the research is very mixed, and it really depends on how you look at it. But I mean, I think, and that's the research in the 90s, for example, and early 2000s. I do wonder if it's different now, because even in the kind of the cases that we're telling you, and it's so widespread and it's so ubiquitous, and that it's just, and you're talking about kids that are like 6, 7 years old who are, finding this stuff on the internet, who are being supervised. I find it hard to understand how it wouldn't have an impact on the behavior, as ubiquitous as it is, or at least on sort of, again, ideas about what's healthy sexually and expectations sexually and so. But
Would you expect like a corresponding rise in offending? So like, obviously there's been an explosion of like porn availability. Has that corresponded with a rise in like offending by young people?
I'm not aware of sort of any market increases in offending. Of course, there's been spikes in sexual assault because of advocacy and reporting. But in terms of among youth, and especially now with, and I think this must be the same down there, but it's that time of the political side, not just the political cycle, but it's that time of the decade when everybody gets worried about youth crime again. So, and these things kind of go in cycles, right? And so I'm not really convinced that there's been a huge increase in sexual offending per se. I could be wrong, but yeah, I think it's something worth revisiting, and not to dismiss it outright because of earlier research that was done in a very different context, for example.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, I think that's about all we have time for. Thank you again, on behalf of everyone that's attended, on behalf of the centre. Jesse, that was a wonderful talk. There was a lot there. So this will be available on YouTube if you want a second viewing, or to, recommend it to your friends and family, and could be something to watch. But it will be available in the next couple of weeks. I will be sending, as I said, a feedback form for those of you who attended. So if you can fill that out, that would be greatly appreciated. And finally, if you can join us next month, if you join the mailing list, you'll hear all about this. We have Superintendent David Cohen from Victoria Police, who will be telling us about evidence-based policing, a number of trials that they've been running down here in Victoria around reducing offending. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much.
Goodbye. Have a good night.